All right, so you're interested in USAID, huh? Specifically how it might be connected to media and, well, influence all around the world.
Sounds intriguing.
Yeah, and get this, we were going through this interview with Mike Ben on the Joe Rogan
Oh,
Experience.
yeah, I've heard of him.
Yeah, and he goes really deep on USAID, claiming they're shaping these narratives and legal systems not just overseas, but potentially with impacts right here at home. Wild stuff. So
Wow.
we're going to unpack all that. But before we go there,
Okay.
let's back up a sec. What do we actually know about USAID? Just the basics.
So USAID, it stands for the United States Agency for International Development. It's a government agency, and its main job is, well, it's basically in charge of civilian foreign aid and development assistance.
Okay.
So they work in a lot of different areas,
Right.
everything from economic development and global health to, promoting democracy and humanitarian assistance, the whole nine yards.
So at a basic level, they're all about helping other countries, right?
Right, exactly.
But Benz claims there's another side to their work. He calls it a secrecy doctrine. What's that all about?
Yeah, so Benz claims that this doctrine, it was established way back in 1948
Okay.
as a way to justify conducting covert political warfare, influencing foreign governments, securing access to resources, all without needing like a full-blown military presence.
Right.
So think of it like
Kind of shaping events, like behind the scenes.
exactly pulling strings, influencing things from the shadows.
Okay, so why all the secrecy then? If it's supposed to be in U.S. interests, why not just be open about it?
Well, Benz argues that, back then, the American public might not have been so comfortable with this whole idea of like covert manipulation.
Oh, I see.
There was a clear line between war and peace, and this doctrine, it kind of blurred those lines, operating in that gray area.
Makes sense. So how does all of this connect to what we see happening today in the present?
Well, Benz claims this doctrine is still very much in effect and points to USAID's activities as proof. He brings up the Smith-Mundt Act. Initially, this act, it prohibited the U.S. government from, well, using propaganda on its own citizens.
Okay, right.
But then there's this update in 2012, the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act, and Benz argues, well, he argues that it basically repealed that protection.
Hold on. So you're saying we could be subject to the same tactics they use to influence other countries?
It's definitely a possibility. That Modernization Act, it loosened the restrictions on how the U.S. government could share, their information materials. So whether that equates to actual propaganda being used on U.S. citizens, that's up for debate.
Right.
But it definitely makes you think about media literacy these days and how important critical thinking is in the current information landscape, with everything going on.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely something to think about. And this brings us to another one of Benz's claims. He says USAID spends millions on programs they call judicial reform, but what they're really doing is trying to influence legal systems to align with U.S. interests.
It's an interesting claim. He's basically suggesting that USAID's involvement in judicial reform might have, ulterior motives, potentially shaping legal systems to favor the U.S.
Okay.
To really understand his argument, it's helpful to look at the bigger picture, U.S. foreign policy and how these initiatives fit into all of that.
So it's not just about promoting fair and impartial justice systems in these other countries.
Well, officially, USAID says it's committed to supporting the rule of law and, strengthening democratic institutions globally. They're all about that.
Okay.
But Benz, he's skeptical. Suggests it might be a cover for advancing those U.S. interests. He even uses the term capacity building.
Capacity building.
Yeah, to describe what he sees as, well, basically a tactic to strengthen those entities that are aligned with U.S. foreign policy goals. And often they do this under the guise of humanitarian aid or development assistance.
It all sounds, I don't know, kind of murky, to be honest. If we're talking about this kind of influence on other countries, what does it actually look like in practice?
Well, that's where Benz brings up a specific example.
Oh, okay.
The OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project.
Oh, interesting.
He uses them as like a prime example of how this influence plays out on the ground. So could you tell us a bit more about them, the OCCRP?
Yeah, for sure. So what is the OCCRP all about?
So the OCCRP, they're an investigative journalism organization.
Okay.
They get funding from a bunch of different sources, USAID, the U.S. State Department, different places.
Okay.
And their whole thing is they investigate and report on organized crime and corruption all around the world. And, their work often leads to arrests, fines, policy changes, all that.
Right. Benz claims that OCCRP actually boasts about the impact they've had, saying they've triggered billions in fines and even toppled governments.
Wow.
Yeah, he specifically mentioned a claim of a 20,000% return on investment. That's a crazy number.
That is a huge number, yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's impressive, for sure. But it makes you wonder how they're actually calculating that return on investment.
Right.
And what exactly are they taking into account? A purely financial metric that might not fully capture the complexities of their work and the impact they have on all these different countries and their political landscapes.
So is it even possible to separate their investigative work from, the potential influence of their funders, especially when those funders might have certain outcomes they're looking for?
Yeah, that's the question.
That's what we'll dive into next.
Yeah, it's a complicated situation for sure.
Right.
On the one hand, OCCRP, they've definitely uncovered some serious stuff, holding powerful people and institutions accountable.
Right.
Their work, it's hard to deny, it has helped expose corruption and, well, promote transparency in many parts of the world.
Okay, yeah, that's true. But if most of their funding comes from organizations with their own agendas, doesn't that raise some red flags?
Yeah, you got to think about that. It's a valid point. I mean, you have to remember that any organization, no matter who's funding them, they're always operating without a certain context.
Right.
They have their own specific editorial guidelines.
Sure.
So it's not always black and white.
Yeah, Benz argues that OCCRP's focus, especially on corruption in certain countries, often lines up a little too neatly with U.S. foreign policy objectives.
Interesting.
Like he points to their coverage of Russia and China, countries the U.S. sees as, well, rivals.
Yeah, rivals, adversaries.
Exactly.
It's true that those geopolitical factors, they can influence what news stories get chosen, how they're framed,
Right.
even in organizations that are, committed to being objective.
Right.
It's a tough one. The challenge is figuring out if these influences are actually compromising the integrity of the investigation or if they're just reflecting the reality of, well, a very complex global landscape.
It's a tough line to walk, for sure.
Definitely.
Benz actually goes so far as to suggest that OCCRP might be actively involved in, get this, regime change efforts.
Whoa.
Yeah, he mentions a documentary where the head of OCCRP supposedly admits to this.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
Yeah,
Definitely would need further investigation.
for sure.
I mean, if that documentary exists and if what they're saying is verifiable, then yeah, we'd need to look at the context.
Totally.
Like, what was the situation when those statements were made?
Yeah, good point. He also encourages listeners to do their own research, just Google USAID judicial reform.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. I've gone down that rabbit hole myself, and let me tell you, it's deep.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you find all these programs, all these initiatives, all aimed at reforming judicial systems in different countries.
Okay.
And often, USAID is right there involved.
Interesting.
It's up to each person to decide whether those programs are actually promoting good change or if they're, maybe serving as a tool for the U.S. to push its own interests.
It feels like we're peeling back the layers of an onion here.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
The more we learn about UAE, the more questions we have.
Exactly. About their real intentions and how it all affects the countries they're working in.
Right, exactly.
It makes you realize that foreign aid, development assistance, it's never really neutral.
Right.
It's always tied up with geopolitical interests, economic factors, ideological agendas.
So how do we, just as everyday people, navigate all of this? How do we separate genuine help from, maybe a hidden attempt to control things?
That is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer, unfortunately. But I'd say a good place to start is developing critical thinking skills.
Okay, what does that look like, practically speaking?
It means questioning everything.
Okay.
Don't take anything at face value, especially if it's coming from a source that might have a vested interest.
Right.
Look for diverse perspectives,
Okay.
even perspectives that challenge your own beliefs,
Right.
and learn the spot bias, not just in the information you're taking in,
Right.
but also in yourself.
Yeah, being aware of your own biases.
Exactly. So we can approach all this information with, a more critical eye.
Yeah, so it's not just about being skeptical of what we read and hear, but also understanding our own preconceived notions
Exactly.
and how those might be coloring our understanding of things.
Yeah, we all have biases, and it's important to just, admit that to ourselves.
Right.
So we can be more discerning.
It sounds like we need to be more active in shaping our understanding of the world,
Yeah,
not just passively consuming information.
that's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
We all have a responsibility to engage with this stuff critically, to question the narratives we're given, and to search for the truth,
Right.
even when it's uncomfortable or challenging.
Benz doesn't paint a very optimistic picture.
Yeah,
It's like this world where governments and powerful institutions, they're pulling the strings, manipulating things for their own benefit.
I see what you mean.
Is there any reason to be optimistic in all of this?
I think the optimism comes from our potential, our ability to become more aware,
Right.
to be more discerning, more engaged citizens.
Yeah.
The more we know, the better equipped we are to, challenge those who try to manipulate us
Right.
and to demand transparency and accountability from our leaders.
So this whole conversation about USAID and media and influence, it's really about our own role in shaping the world.
I think that's a great insight.
Yeah.
We all have a part to play in creating a world that's more just, more equitable, more transparent.
Right.
And it starts with being informed, being engaged, and, being willing to ask those tough questions.
We've certainly raised a lot of questions today.
We have.
Hopefully, our listeners have some tools to start finding some answers.
That's the goal.
We can't cover everything in one deep dive.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So, what would you say are the key takeaways for our listeners? What should they really remember from all of this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is, like we said before, just being more aware of the information we're taking in.
Right, not just accepting things blindly.
Exactly. It's easy to just skim the headlines, but it's so important to, really dig deeper.
Yeah, consider the source.
Think about potential biases.
Right, and like we were saying, be aware of how information can be manipulated.
Yeah, sometimes things are presented in a way that, well, isn't the full story.
It's about having that healthy skepticism, right?
Totally, and being willing to challenge those narratives that might not be telling the whole truth.
It's tough though, right? Especially with how much information we're bombarded with every day.
I know, right? Information overload.
So, do you have any practical tips for how to be a more critical consumer of information?
A good place to start is by diversifying your news sources.
Okay.
Don't just rely on one outlet.
Right, branch out.
Read articles from different publications,
Okay.
domestic, international, and see how they cover the same story.
Right, compare and contrast.
Exactly, and look for that factual reporting,
Okay.
evidence-based analysis.
Not just opinion pieces, yeah.
Right, or stuff that's super emotionally charged.
So, what about those times when you come across something that's shocking or outrageous?
That's when critical thinking is super important.
Okay.
You got to take a step back and ask yourself, who benefits from this information being presented this way?
Right.
What's the motivation behind it? Is there another side to the story that's not being told?
So it's about understanding the context of the information.
Exactly. Understanding that there's a purpose, a potential agenda behind everything.
Right, right.
And if you're aware of that, well, you can start filtering out the noise and get closer to the truth.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about manipulation and critical thinking, but what about taking action? What can our listeners actually do if they're concerned about these issues?
I'd say talk about it.
Okay.
Have conversations with friends, family, share your concerns, listen to different perspectives.
Right.
You can also reach out to your elected officials, let them know what you think about USAID or any other policies that you're worried about.
That's a good point. We're not totally powerless in all of this.
Not at all. We can use our voices, make our concerns known.
Demand transparency and accountability.
Exactly. And remember, change often starts locally. Get involved in your community, support organizations that are promoting transparency and good governance.
Right.
Volunteer your time, donate to causes you believe in.
So even though these issues seem global, we can make a difference on a smaller scale.
Absolutely. Every step towards greater awareness, critical thinking, civic engagement, it all helps.
Ben's also mentioned a few specific resources for listeners who want to learn more.
Oh, yeah?
He suggested Googling USAID judicial reform, and he mentioned a documentary that supposedly sheds some light on OCCRP's activities.
Those are good starting points. But, like we've been saying, approach them with a critical eye.
Right. Consider the source, potential biases, all that.
Exactly.
So it always comes back to critical thinking.
It always does.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive.
It has.
We've covered so much, from that secrecy doctrine to practical tips for navigating the information age.
It's definitely a lot to think about.
It is, and hopefully our listeners are feeling inspired to learn more and engage with these issues.
I hope so, too.
So until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and never stop questioning what you're being told. NAB. A 10-year